There's no non-radical future. Either you have a radical future where you change everything, or you have a radical future where you have climatic changes and the world looks completely different.
On one level, people wonder, are we facing civilizational collapse, for example? And if not, what are we facing? And sort of like, what's that timeline?
This is a really good and difficult question.
Hello, Dr. Paul Behrens. I'm so grateful to be speaking to you this morning. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, Amakai. Great to be speaking with you too.
It's great to speak to you. So I finished your book recently, the best of times, the worst of times, and I'm gonna be totally honest with you. For months, for about 6 months, I've really had not had any anxiety. Thank God, because something that I've struggled with. But your book gave me anxiety. Like real anxiety. And yeah, it was an intense read.
Yeah, I'm sorry to give the anxiety. I'm sorry to be the downer. I think one of the things that is so tough about the subject, and actually other environmental problems that we face, is they are difficult to look at and they're difficult to accept. And I even find on my day-to-day work and in my life, I have to be very careful about it, because it can really sort of let you take over. You can let it take over, and it can also be energy sapping and demotivating. And I hope that along with some of that anxiety, there was also a sense that if we work towards this hopeful future, things look a lot better.
Yeah, and we'll jump into some of that. But can you start by telling us a little bit about your background and what brought you to writing this book and to this research?
Yeah, so my background initially was in physics. I worked to find good places for wind turbines in complex terrain. So I worked in sort of atmospheric flow and what wind does. And then I took a sort of fairly meandering path between academia and policy, and even some business representative groups of wind, for example, through working at the Royal Society of New Zealand for a while, and now working as a professor of environmental change at Leiden University. And so now I work across a number of different domains: energy, food, climate change. And that's what really sort of brought together sort of the holistic view that I wanted to bring across in the book. Which is the sort of how things interconnect, how society interconnects with the environment, and how these very big picture systems that we all rely on every day influence the world in the way that they do, and what it looks like if that continues the way it is, and what we can do about it.
Yeah, and it's meticulously sourced and draws from all sorts of domains, especially the physical sciences, physics. I want to read some quotes from the book as we start off here. I feel like that's might be helpful in getting sort of the viewer or the listener on the same page, just understanding sort of what this conversation is, what the context is. If my quotes go on too long or something, hopefully that won't happen, but I don't think it will. But we could edit that afterwards. But these are some of the quotes that for me really stood out, and again gave a sense of like what this book is about. And so I want people to sort of appreciate the tone here. So I have in front of me. Quote, "In a very real sense, it's already too late. We have failed. Millions of people have already died from climate disruption. Millions more are currently suffering, and somewhere between hundreds of millions and billions are in the firing line. This is not like the other human problems we believe we can eventually get around to fixing. Problems like global poverty, hunger, modern slavery, the ones we believe are slowly improving even if they aren't. The ones we assume will eventually get there, wherever there is. Climate change isn't a problem to clean up eventually, like a chemical spill. Climate breakdown is a trap which we have set and into which humans have decidedly stepped. It presents a retreating frontier, no longer a future of expansive human possibility, but one of struggle and limitation." Skipping a bit. "Now the scientific numbers are becoming manifest. Heat waves, droughts, floods, hurricanes, wildfires. Everywhere we look, things are changing beyond recognition. It would take several books to describe the unprecedented death and destruction in the past few years alone." And then you go on to describe what that looks like. And then skipping ahead, "These past few years, as horrendous as they've been, are the best we can hope for in the future. From now on, these years will feel like a brief reprieve. Even if we cease all emissions today, things may still get worse for several centuries. As a species, we have careened up to and off a cliff and are now having a midair civilization crisis, arguing about what to do as we plummet. I have more quotes, but I think I'll stop there. That's a lot of quotes already.
So, I mean, yeah, you know, what I'm trying to do there is the book, which I should say to viewers, is interleaving chapters of pessimism and hope. So you can both hold in your mind the case that that is true, that we have had horrendous climate impacts already, impacts that we should never forget, impacts that we are showing more and more through scientific papers that are directly due to, you know, emissions, excuse me, but that the future that we head towards can be better on the whole for many, many people. And so you can hold these, they almost seem conflicting in a way, but actually they're not. We need to be clear about the pessimism of where we're going and the hope of which we can change the trajectory. Yeah, and that's, excuse me, that's a very complex message, and it's the sort of the complex message of the book. And I think hopefully we could try to understand that more as we go along in this conversation. Sort of how those two things are compatible. I mean, I'll say you did structure the book with pessimistic chapters and optimistic chapters, and I think it's a beautiful kind of parallelism. But as a reader, the pessimistic chapters seem to hit harder. I don't know. Maybe that's my own bias coming into the book. It could be. I mean, I think, yeah, that's interesting. I think readers can take things both ways and read into each chapter perhaps with more sort of emotional heft, and that maybe does depend on people's original outlook. I think sometimes the pessimism chapters do feel a bit bleak because we have acted far too late and these impacts are manifest, and this is something that just does not seem to be changing. But as I point out at the start of the book, one thing we can rely on is change. And in the book, I'd point to lots and lots of hopeful trends that we're currently seeing that are also accelerating. Do
you want to mention some of those?
Yeah, so I mean, things like the activism that we're seeing around the world, that's very important, and actually probably the most important. That's not just activism out on the streets, but things like legal activism. There's already over 1,000 different lawsuits around the world holding governments and corporations to account for their environmental impacts, for the climate impact specifically. And these have huge systemic impacts on the rest of society. If governments are legally obliged to meet certain targets for emissions, then this is a significant pressure against established interests, against the high emitting sectors of the economy, these sorts of things that have to be addressed, you know. So these are really hopeful trends. We also see that at least the rhetoric, and I have to be a bit careful here, the rhetoric is increasing faster and faster about targets, about goals, about when we get to net zero, where different countries trying to, you know, outdo one another about the trajectories that they're taking. Now, we're still seeing, you know, the atmosphere doesn't care about our words, and we're still seeing increases. But it is hopeful the way in which we're seeing such rapid change. And the final one I probably mention is, even on an economic basis, if we look at where the largest majority of greenhouse gas emissions are coming from, which is in the energy sector, we already have the solutions there, and many of them are cheaper now to implement new than to continue our existing way. So it's cheaper in many areas of the world now to install solar, to install wind, new, all the land, all the interconnections, all the labor, than to continue running the older fossil fuel plants. And so that really revolutionizes what you can expect from the future, what we can do if we put our minds to it, if we can get these social dimensions on board, get ourselves moving as fast as possible and overcoming the incumbent interests, the fossil fuel companies, the high carbon impact companies.
Yeah. Yeah. And at one point, I think, I forget the exact word, maybe it's like a hyper object or something, is how you describe this problem because it's so multifaceted, and at times to many people it might feel even incomprehensible with how far-reaching it is.
That's actually from a philosopher called Timothy Morton, and the book's in the notes there. And there's a little bit of controversy within the environmental movement about this, because they say, well, in a sense, it's very simple. We stop emitting. But I do think that the hyperobject quite nicely describes this struggle to try and comprehend the whole picture. And this is, when you think about climate change and you think about what we have to do in response to climate change and, other environmental issues like biodiversity, it does imply a shift in the economy, in the way that we live our lives, in the way that we live. I mean, it is cross-cutting across all of the different ways in which we live day to day. So, I that's why I personally don't mind the terms that much, and I think it's quite evocative of a confusion that we can have when we're looking at the bigger picture. And hopefully, in the book, I sort of start to describe some of the shape of this object. But so that's one of the reasons why I brought that up there.
Yeah, and I want to come back to this, and I want to sort of explore more of these, like the tendrils, which this book explores. All the different ways in which it impacts our lives and our societies and our governments and the future in all different ways. So, but before I do, I mean, there's a lot of climate change skepticism and denialism in my country, in America. There's a famous moment from the Obama years, so not long ago, when we had a Republican senator bring a snowball onto the floor of Congress
in Hoff,
to say that climate change isn't real. So what would you say to someone who thinks that you're just another prophet of doom? You're just another doomsayer. Every year, every generation, there's doomsayers. Thomas Malthus thought that we were gonna have a overrun by too many people on the planet, wouldn't be able to feed them, and he was wrong. And scientists thought that we'd be covered in ice by now. Is that what do you say to that?
It depends on how far you're talking. I mean, if you're saying the pure sort of skepticism of I don't think climate change exists. I mean, first of all, that's really no longer worth engaging with that much, to be perfectly honest. Every single country in the world has signed on to the summary for policymakers in the recent IPCC report, which means that basically every government and country in the world is saying it's an established fact. It is unequivocal that humans have warmed the planet and climate change is real and is causing this damage. So, in order to be skeptical of climate change, you would have to be skeptical of every single government in the world, from China to the US, from Norway to New Zealand, lots of different types of governments. You'd have to say that they would be all lying. You would have to be saying that all the major scientific institutes, all the major scientists around the world would be lying. You'd also have to be suggesting that the measurements are made up somehow, and that even the lived experience of many people over the last few years is not valid, is not true, because what we're starting to see is that the weather extremes are shifting so much with the climate change that we currently have, that this is quite visible to a lot of people. So I think this is shaking a lot of people out of their slumber. So I don't really spend a lot of time thinking about how to convince the true skeptics. I don't think there's any sort of way to, or effective way to necessarily reach in an efficient way people who are that strongly committed to an idea. Normally it has much more to do with other things in their lives, their other values, their other motivations, than it has anything to do with the science, anything to do with the interpretation of information. So I don't really typically spend much time there. I think, what's worth spending more time is the sort of the majority of people, I think, who in the back of their minds know something's wrong. There's this bubbling uncertainty, there's this bubbling maybe stress, anxiety, as you put it, and communicating and reaching out to them to tell them how much they should be worried. How much effort should we be making to change? And I think that comes back to that point where you're saying, oh, well, maybe Paul's just another doomist. He's a bit like Thomas Malthus, and that never came through. And I talk about that in the book. It didn't come true. And that there are many ways in which humans manage to escape what are called progress traps, what are referred to in the book as progress traps, which goes back to other work. And that, that negativity is more a reflection of the fact that we don't typically tend to address these problems head on. We tend to invent new ways to try and get out of them. And that's one of the ways in which I was trying to highlight some of the dangers in the book, things like solar geoengineering, which we can perhaps talk about, which we may end up using. I mean, I'm not saying that, we won't use it, but more that we don't address the underlying root causes of lots of these problems. So I think that's what I would say, and I'm not trying to be a prophet of doom, because I'm trying to give the options that we have and the trajectories that we have for the future, and what that looks like when we do it. Because for a vast majority of the things that we know we need to do anyway, most of us already have a sense that needs to be done, even if you haven't seen the scientific research on it. We end up in a better world, a healthier world. We live in more healthier ways. We have healthier diets. We have healthier brains. We're not pumping air particulates into our brains from our fossil fuel infrastructure, into our organs. I mean, there's so many different ways in which the world looks like a better place. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say. If people said, "Oh, Paul's another doomist."
Yeah, and there's obviously a spectrum of denialism. A lot of it is just people who aren't interested in looking at the problem, or aren't interested in thinking about it or reading about it, which is sort of like a soft kind of denialism. They're denial by just not looking at the reality.
Or a denial by delay. I mean,
right.
there's a fantastic paper called Discourses of Delay, and these are the sorts of things that people come up with to not take the action that is cheaper for society, more healthy for society. And these discourses, they can range, but a very common one is things like, well, we're just one country, or I'm just one person, or if everybody thinks like that, we're never going to get there. So I think that's where a lot of the sort of more modern sort of climate denial has shifted to, is this sense that, it's a problem, we need to get around to it, but not me and not now. And we can wait for a while until we extract more fossil fuels, we burn more fossil fuels.
Yeah, and to give a sense of where we are in America, like the Green New Deal, which is like this proposal of some congressmen and women of the progressive left in America, which I think gets mentioned maybe at one point in your book. I'm not sure, but I think has been criticized as like being not adequate in what needs to be done, is such a fringe view in like American politics. It's even in like the centrist Democrat, like liberal, like discourse, it's seen as being like way too extreme,
Yeah, I mean, that is interesting. There is a disconnect even amongst the sort of more extreme sort of whatever you would say extreme sort of proposals. I mean, Kevin Anderson has a great saying. He says, there's no non-radical future. Either you have a radical future where you change everything, or you have a radical future where you have climatic changes and the world looks completely different, as it will continue to look. In terms of the politics of this, I think it's really fascinating what's happening in different countries and in different communities. In the UK, we had a citizens' assembly on climate change, where we brought together over 100 people from across the country, different demographics, and sat them down with scientists and talked about the issues that we're facing and what sort of options we have to address those issues, and then asked these people, what would you like to do? If you were the government, if you could develop policy about, the different trade-offs here, what would you suggest? And, it's incredible when you ask people what they would actually consider. They were talking about frequent flyer levies, paying taxes if you take frequent flights, banning SUVs. I mean, these are people who are just selected from across the community. These are not environmentalists that saying we would ban SUVs. They were even talking about taxing meat. They walked back a little bit from that in the end, but that this was on the table, And so I think it's really interesting. Now, is this fast enough? Probably even that's not fast enough. But that's far beyond where a lot of the politicians are at. So if you actually ask the people, they're already actually far beyond where the politicians are at. So partly it's actually just even enacting where the people want to go, where the public wants to go. And there's probably this constant, communication battle whereby you don't want to disencourage what movement we do have, whilst continually pushing that movement even further and further and further to what it needs to be. Because in practice, if you actually follow what the science is suggesting to make 1.5 degrees, we're talking about 10% reductions in greenhouse gas emissions year on year, 10%. Which is, a sustained reduction of what we saw over the lockdowns over COVID. In fact, even just a little bit more than that. And, depending on how you cut the budget, because the budgets are uncertain, it should be even faster. Now, these are extreme reductions. So, yeah, even those sorts of things that I was just talking about in the Citizens Assembly are still not fast enough.
Yeah. And that ties into how multifaceted this is, because failures of climate change policy, I think, are often failures of democracy, as you're saying. I think people often are willing to make necessary changes, but are in America, where I think about the government that I worry about the most. I see the limitations of democracy and the limitations of what the people want all the time, all around me.
Yeah, it's quite anecdotal, but I'll never forget a colleague once said, "I need saving from myself." She said, "I don't want to eat so much meat, but I really I don't want to, and I need saving for myself." And that's a really it's a really interesting way she put it. I hadn't heard her put it that way before.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, I personally agree 100% when it comes to meat, or when it comes to sugars and unhealthy foods in general. I think. Of course, they should be taxed, in my opinion, because they're things that I enjoy. They're vices. But yeah, and then the other point I want to just sort of reflect on a little bit from a moral perspective. I think that human beings have a very strong capacity for deluding themselves, for self-delusion, and morality dictates that we are in touch with reality, because if we refuse to look at reality, suddenly anything becomes possible, and so much of history, the moral failings of our past, in the century, for example, are failures of people to look at what's happening, around them, and see what's so obviously problematic. And the other lesson from history, I think, is that bad things can happen. In the past 100 years, we saw 2 world wars, and the idea that we feel so secure, it feels like we're protected, nothing can happen from us, but that's really an illusion. So yeah, I feel like that's another thing that came up for me when reading your book. Another thing, though, that was very interesting to me was the role that income inequality sort of plays in your book. How the sense in which this climate crisis is tied up with economics. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, there is different types of income inequality. So this is one of the issues that I think, will start coming on the table more and more, is the international picture. As different countries start to make targets, they start to hopefully reach these targets, and we start to see more and more deeper and deeper climate impacts. We'll have to start paying attention more to what's happening multinationally. We should already be doing that, of course. Especially when it comes to things like migration. There was another report out the other day talking about hundreds of millions on the move in the next few decades due to climate impacts. So, when we're talking about sort of income inequality, and we're talking about these inequalities, we can talk about things in terms of internationally, or we can think about things within countries. Now, the international ones are obviously really important, because many of the regions which are most hit by climate impacts, by droughts, by heat waves, by floods, are in regions that have had a historically low income. And the regions of higher income, which are more responsible for a lot of the emissions, are regions which, for a while at least, will see fewer impacts. I mean, they will still see impacts, and don't get me wrong, we still see flooding in the Eifel. I don't know whether you saw that in Germany, for example. Even the best prepared countries struggle to deal with these extreme events. But a lot of this has been happening in poorer regions of the world for a very long time already. And the importance that has is that, if you're not listening to the people who are most exposed to that risk, who have the lowest incomes, who have the lowest say at the table, the lowest economic influence, then you're not reacting to the actual experience lived on the ground of the people who are experiencing it early, who this is coming for everybody, but you're not listening to the people who are most exposed to that risk. And so the people most invested in changing the system, A, aren't responsible for most of the emissions, and B, don't have much of the economic clout and leverage in order to actually change things. And when we look at that on the international level, obviously that's very clear. When we look at national level, the message is actually very similar. A lot of the environmental impacts that you're seeing, this could be air pollution, it can be water pollution, it could be soil, it could be all sorts of different things. A lot of this is correlated with lower incomes because people who are poorer may live near polluting factories or power stations. And the people who have most say over doing something about it, most say about doing something about it, are often insulated from those effects. And we're seeing almost a defection from society at the moment with it, when you hear about billionaires buying bunkers in New Zealand or something like this. These are things that actually sap collective will. These people. if I'm getting quite upset about it, these people shouldn't be allowed to be defecting from society, from the society that they've benefited from the infrastructure that they've actually grown up in. In America, for example, and then escaping to another country and building a bunker in the middle of nowhere. So I think income inequality does play this important role, both within domestic politics, but also internationally.
Yeah. And another way in which I think economics plays a central role in the book, which maybe to you and me at this point feels intuitive, but I think to some people, certainly at one point, it wasn't obvious to me at all, is the way in which markets are limited and the way in which the commons, isn't priced in into our market system. And just something as simple as like the tragedy of the commons, which can be analyzed in like test cases, in like a case like overfishing, for example, where if all the fishermen are acting in their self-interest, they're going to catch fish such that there's no more fish in the pond next year. You're outpacing the rate of reproduction of the fish.
Well, I think there's I didn't talk about tragedy of the commons in the book. At least I remember. If I remember.
No, correctly. I don't think you did. Yeah.
Because I didn't get into it because the tragedy of commons is actually itself kind of a little bit tricky. So the tragedy of the commons is basically this idea that if everybody has access to some resource, then the individual incentive is to overexploit that resource. Well, in evidence at a local scale, this doesn't happen. Humans find ways in which to regulate the commons, access to the commons, but also how much you withdraw from the commons. And a fantastic Nobel Prize-winning economist, Eleanor Ostrom, did a lot of work on this, showing how both formal and informal arrangements, so not just laws, but actually also just community unwritten rules like norms, can protect communal spaces in the long run. But of course, when you get to a market situation where you have, say, a national market, you can disconnect the local sanctions and the local norms in order that actually protect the commons. So if you want to actually protect the commons, economists say you have to internalize the price of the damage that you're doing. Companies can't be allowed to just continue to pollute. They must pay some sort of recovery fee in order to bring the system back to as it was when they founded, of course. And of course, when that happens, then you get into the horseplay of the formal laws about how you get to do that. And then you get to issues of power and you get to issues of income again, which we just talked about. So these are sort of the key issues, is how do you go about building formal laws which actually internalize these costs into, say, market systems, and don't let these markets be totally free to offload these costs, the very real environmental costs, whilst bringing, say, the prices down of their really damaging goods. And there's a really interesting example of what you're talking about that brings both of those aspects together. So international trade and inequality and protecting the commons. And this is things like carbon prices. So in the European Union, we've had the emissions trading scheme for a long time. And this covers about 50% or more emissions in Europe. And it's about 60 euros a ton that companies have to pay and they can trade. Now, one of the issues that people worry about that is that, okay, this is a local, if we come back to this idea of protecting the commons, this is a local law, But if we live in an international world where we're trading with other countries, what's to stop a European car maker just importing very dirty steel from overseas, and they don't have to buy it from the more expensive steel locally because they haven't had to pay that carbon price overseas? And so what the European Union is doing this year is developing a mechanism for levying carbon prices coming on goods coming in from outside the European Union. And this is very interesting because this is an attempt to take a local law. So this could be, on a more local sense, looking after the fish that you were mentioning before in terms of a fishing community, but a local law that's at the European level and applying it far, far away. And so, sorry, that's probably, I don't know whether that's too much detail, but, these are the ways in which local laws and norms interact with the global systems and trade and globalization. And we're starting to see actual movement that I didn't think I would see happen so quickly. Things like this carbon border adjustment mechanism, for example, which may sound very policy wonky, but is very important because what happens is there's an incentive then for the countries that you're trading with to bring in their own carbon prices. Because why not? If they're going to experience those carbon prices in big markets, why not bring their own carbon prices in? And then suddenly people are starting to internalize those costs, as you mentioned before. sorry for talking for quite long there, but I was trying to link to those 2 points you made up: economy and markets.
Yeah, that's great. And I think there's a lot to discuss, and the book goes, I think, into depth. For example, what you're talking about, also how GDP is limited as a measure of our economies and things like that. And so there's a lot there. Let's talk a little bit about sort of tipping points. I mean, there's also a lot of things to worry about still. I think so far we've focused a lot on the changes that have been relatively positive, but there's a lot of the book is about sort of processes that are like self-reinforcing cycles, and the book deals with a branch of physics, which when I was in my undergraduate in physics, I dipped my toes in a little bit, which is like catastrophe theory, and the way in which the statistical tools that describe these kind of catastrophic events. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So what is typically happening over time as we put more and more warming gases into the atmosphere is that we are changing the climate. And the climate is the sort of weather regime that different areas experience. And we are shifting this climate over time. And underneath this, then, we're shifting the energy flows quite significantly, large-scale energy flows. Things like the ways in which the ice caps, or the ways in which heat has moved around in the oceans. We are shifting the distribution of energy and also injecting more energy into the system because we're holding more heat in the atmosphere itself. And so over time, we are shifting the extremes further and further towards the more extremes. And I've actually got a figure I can show you here.
Great, yeah.
If I can share the screen here. And what we can see, this is actually from the IPCC. And what we can see here, hopefully you can see my cursor, is you can see the distribution of temperatures that we would see in different climates. The first one is an increase in the mean temperatures that we might see. So we see this curve, this bell curve. Sometimes we get cold weather, sometimes we get hot weather. And if we're not injecting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, then things may stay reasonably stable, at least over human lifespans. But as we are increasing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, we are increasing the atmosphere's ability to retain heat in the atmosphere, injecting more energy into the atmosphere. And we're moving the mean towards the right here. And so now we have more hot weather and more record hot weather, because this record hot weather, if we see this dotted line and we see this very dark red, this is above anything that we would have seen before. This is what when the IPCC calls unprecedented events. Unprecedented, for a reason, because they're not in the historic record. And so we're seeing more and more historic events, but also a greater frequency of what would have been extreme events previously. So we see more and more extreme events. There's also what also happens is an increase in what's called the variance, so the spread of this graph. So we actually see a spreading of this graph, so that we see, even if with the same mean, more variation because of the warming. And when we add these both together, we get a new climate that looks very, very different.
Right.
And so this, in short, is why we're pushing more and more to extreme events, and why, if we talk about maybe thresholds at which society finds it hard to cope, it's because society is in this unprecedented world when all of our systems are designed around a climate that has disappeared, has gone. All of us agricultural systems, our energy systems, our urban systems, everything is designed around a climate that has disappeared now, and that is much, much warmer and sees much greater extreme events. I'll stop sharing this now.
Sure. And I think we have sort of some intuition around like an increasing mean temperature. Because our statistical brains are probably more comfortable with like a nice even bell curve. But when you talk about expanding the variance, I feel like that is something which is harder to wrap our heads around.
And not only that, is that we often talk in terms of global averages. So we talk in terms of 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees. People say actually our current policies are taking us to above 2 degrees, a little bit above 2 degrees. So we need even more targets, even within the rhetoric. Depending on whether we get even to the targets that we have today. But actually, around the world, we see very different increase in temperatures. The poles have seen increases of 4 or 5 degrees above normal. So, we actually see different warming across the planet, as well as this variance, these different extremes, these moving the weather, the extreme events towards the tails there.
Yeah, and also in my probability courses back in my undergraduate physics days. So I can't speak to exactly how applicable this is, but we talk about, again, like a standard normal distribution versus a power law distribution, which has this fat tail, and the power laws come up a lot in catastrophe theory. So when we think about even without climate change in the context of hurricanes or earthquakes, you deal with these fat tail distributions. And there's this extremely relevant for like insurance companies, and if we're planning for risk of our planetary risk, these are obviously the most relevant things to worry about. And it's so unintuitive because on these fat tails, the variance is so wide at times it can even be undefined, that it's really hard to plan for risk. Yes, absolutely. So the idea here really is that if you are unlucky and you get hit by multiple events at one time, the impacts can be much, much larger than being hit by one event at one time. So in sequence. So if I get a drought and a heat wave at the same time, or a flood and a hurricane at the same time, it's very different to being hit by a flood and then a few months later a hurricane. The impacts then are non-linear. You can get a complete collapse of a community. And so often it's the ways in which different pressures that society are already experiencing combine to flip the society into a completely different state. These are really important things to think about when we're thinking about the global food system. We have a global food system which is incredibly efficient, but relies on a certain number of breadbaskets around the world, areas where large amounts of food are produced. Places like areas of Brazil, the southern US, the areas in around the Black Sea, some areas in Canada. Now, if you have more and more extreme events and they hit all at the same, several at the same time. So, for example, you get a Katrina-style hurricane in the US and you get flooding in the Brazilian Amazon, then suddenly you're knocking off about 40% of all the soybeans in the world that's being traded. And you're going to see huge price spikes. These soybeans go to feed animals. They go to lots of different types of products. This was an example, by the way, given by somebody who, Chatham House researcher, who wrote a report on choke points in the global food system. And then it becomes a little bit easier to see how multiple events, which, yes, they're unlucky, so we wouldn't expect to see them often, but could have such huge ramifications for society. And another non-linearity which comes up in the book and is often talked about, but maybe you know, we don't have to go into it right now, but is these like feedback loops and these tipping points in the weather system, so that like the melting of Arctic ice changes the way in which sun is reflected from those solar ice
there's a
caps.
really so I think people, as you said, Amichai, Kai, sorry, there is this sort of like understanding a little bit of these feedbacks. And a classic one is the ice in the Arctic. As the ice melts, you're turning that white surface into the blue of the ocean, which allows the blue of the ocean to heat up more, which then melts more ice, then in a reinforcing cycle. There are other dynamics for feedbacks of ice sheets as well, quite a few different dynamics, where most of them are positive feedbacks in terms of degrading the ice sheets more and more. What's important to note is that the models generally suggest that once you get to net zero, you generally halt the warming. Generally, there's a large amount of uncertainty depending on what you assume for aerosols, for different greenhouse gases. We could see some continuing warming, but in general, when you get to net zero, it sort of evens out. However, what I think that message misses is that the energy, the systems, the large scale systems, the energy in the system can still be shifting around even under that elevated state. So we can still see continuing sea level rise. I mean, we would still see continuing sea level rise on the order of centuries, even if we get to net zero. So this is bringing, this is really sort of long-term thinking. It's like, how are you going to deal with that in the future? And so with these tipping points, it's important to disconnect perhaps what we can expect for the large-scale systems and for the general sort of theory, and what could happen to temperatures.
Yeah. So many people at some point in their life, unfortunately, will have the experience of going to a doctor and saying, like, doctor, I need like the honest truth. Don't sugarcoat it. I want to know, what's my prognosis health-wise. And so in this analogy, you're obviously, the doctor here, so to speak. So what are the things like specifically that we need to be thinking about, either anticipating or worrying about as a risk? On one level, people wonder, are we facing civilizational collapse, for example? And if not, what are we facing? And sort of like, what's that timeline?
This is a really good and difficult question. In a sense, we've been facing civilizational collapse even before, the appreciation of climate change in nuclear catastrophe. Humans for a while have been, facing a civilizational collapse under certain situations, under certain stresses. The difference with climate change is it's almost happening, for a lot of people, out of sight, out of mind. It's almost like your nuclear apocalypse has not been noticed. Your asteroid, that's about to hit the Earth has not been appreciated. I think the appreciation is becoming more and more real, but it depends on how much, how fast we act, depends on how much of a catastrophe we see. I think I've got to be a bit careful here, because I think there's a lot of different opinions out there from different scientists, and I can't scientifically prove collapse at any particular points. Humans are resourceful. There are ways to address different things. I think for most scientists, it's very difficult to imagine how organized society continues at temperatures of temperatures that are possible this century. So, if we get to 3-4 degrees, I think a lot of people struggle to imagine how that might work. It was obviously very difficult to imagine the internet before that came along, but this is a little bit different in that our entire environment, our entire food system, our entire energy system, water systems, everything is reliant on a certain temperature. So this is a little bit different than that. In terms of what I am really concerned about is I actually think that we will do better than what the current projections of, say 2.3, 4, 5 for our current pledges. I think our pledges will continue to increase as people see every year things get worse. But I'm also concerned that the environmental impacts are also increasing quite quickly. And we've actually underestimated these large-scale processes that I mentioned before. We've been very, very good as a scientific community, or at least I should say others have who run the climate models, about temperature, really, really spot on with temperature. What has been underestimated perhaps is the level to which those temperatures then relate to environmental changes. To weather changes and weather extremes. I think that there has been a broad sort of underestimation of how bad that could get. So in my perspective, I have a sort of short-term concerns, and I have then the long-term sort of big, picture concerns. And my short-term concerns are really to do with these breadbasket failures. I think there's more and more studies coming out suggesting that you could increase breadbasket failures 3-4 times once we get to 1.5 degrees by 2030, and then towards 2050, you're really increasing the odds higher and higher and higher. And that's when I start, so in terms of the short-term stuff, I'm really concerned about that. And I think that's an important message probably to communicate to people about the urgency. Now, if I'm the doctor and I'm prescribing, the prescription, first of all, we live in a democracy, so I would be a doctor of many doctors, and hopefully all of us should be involved in this conversation about how we get there. But what I would say is that however you make it happen, we actually just have to get things done now. And I know that that's maybe a bit of a cop-out. So how do you get things done? You can set tighter and tighter regulations. You can even start just having national programs. A really good example of this is insulation, for example, in houses. The UK, for example, has a terrible insulation, has a terrible building stock for insulation. I think the US does too. I think the US is pretty bad with insulation too. This is really just obvious stuff to do. And the reason why we struggle to do it is because it's hard administratively and it's hard societally to get this done in a sort of market sense. So, maybe just get on and do it. Maybe just have a national program, nationalize the program and just get it done. There is more scope for government to lead on this with the people, so being, citizens' assemblies and good oversight and good judicial review and things like this. So I'm not saying like, big governments come in and fix everything, but I'm saying, decentralized power, but, nationalized programs that are actually going to do the things we know need to get done. So that's what I would say is more consideration of the large scale things that we know we need to do. Massive rollout of renewable energy, massive energy efficiency programs, real decentralization of eating meat, especially beef, which uses about 30% of global land in order to produce meat. We just don't have space for that anymore, and we need that space to be drawing down carbon in natural carbon solutions. I think we need all of the above. So we need all of society moving in that way. Some commentators suggest we actually need a mobilization like we've seen in the world wars. You need to actually say to factories, you're not building that anymore. Like in the Second World War, it wasn't like you're building cars anymore. Now you're building tanks, and you guys are now building airplanes. And yeah, I think maybe there's a little bit of that, some more direction from government or more encouragement to see the speed that we need to see. And that's what it's about right now, is the speed that we need to see.
Yeah. One of the sort of the pieces of rhetoric you hear on the right in America a lot, and it's a specific example of it is like around Bernie Sanders. So Bernie Sanders is an American senator, and he's a progressive. He supports the Green New Deal. He's whole life really dedicated to climate change issues, for example. It's always been the forefront of his policy. But he's very wealthy because he's a successful senator in America, and he's written many very popular books, and so he owns like 3 large houses. So the right will always say, he's such a hypocrite. He owns 3 houses, and he's talking about shrinking our economy and things like that. And that sort of rhetoric comes up a lot. And it's something that I think about because I'm lucky. I mean, I'm wealthy relatively myself. I'm affluent, and as someone who's affluent, I drive my car and I run my air conditioners in the summertime. And I once a year, I'll take flights, and these are things that I feel guilty about at times. But it's how do you balance that personal responsibility element on the one hand versus the policy element on the other hand? And is there hypocrisy in being wealthy and in living a wealthy lifestyle?
I think the critique of hypocrisy is a little bit limited. I mean, in a sense, so what you want to improve society for the better, it really depends on the individual and what they have had to go through in order to make the decisions they've had. You know, some things are sacrifices, some things are not sacrifices, they're just exploration, you know, in terms of changes. So to give you an example, when I shifted to a vegetarian diet, I still struggle myself to be a vegan. When I shifted to a vegetarian diet, I found it hugely exciting and like a huge opportunity, you know, really, really lovely. And I really enjoyed it. I also felt a lot better for it. I mean, these are all anecdotal things, of course, but I'm just saying from my experience. Then there are other things that are sacrifices. You know, I stopped flying, and that's a sacrifice. That I got to a stage a few years back where I just thought, I just cannot do this anymore. I just feel awful every time I get on a plane. Now, I'm lucky because I live in Europe and I have a good system, a public transport system, which allows me to get around, and I can still visit other countries. Maybe not go as far afield as I would have liked, but that is a sacrifice. So some things, I think, we have to bear in mind that some things are sacrifices and some things are explorations, and that it's always upon us to negotiate that with ourselves, you know, and listen to ourselves and listen to our emotions about it. For me, it wasn't because I was wanting to make a stand and I'm not going to fly anymore. It's because it was feeling worse and worse, you know, and then I just thought, this is it, that's enough. But we're all stuck in systems which require a certain amount of emission. You know, you probably need a car to get to work, or you were reliant on the food that's available at your local shop. So, you know, there's only so far that people can go in order to sacrifice, and we need to make it easier and easier to make the choices which are more healthy for us. And part of that's just getting rid of the uneven playing field that we currently have. There are huge incentives for fossil fuel exploration around the world still. There are still subsidies for fossil fuel exploration. There are still subsidies for animal agriculture. The animal agricultural power and lobby is very strong. So even just getting rid of the uneven playing field, where in America, for example, it's incredibly difficult to buy affordable fresh fruit and vegetables. I mean, it's astonishing. It's often cheaper to go and get cheap meat with huge environmental harms than vegetables. So, you know, maybe shifting the playing field. Governments do this all the time. They shift the playing field of the market. And so that enables people to make those choices, which maybe then are not so much of a sacrifice anymore. In terms of this argument about, being a hypocrite, you know, I can see that. I can see how that feels quite righteous, you know, and I can see that argument. But I think on the whole, if it's going to stop you doing something, then forget about it. You know, you're not doing it for other people. You're doing it for yourself. You're doing it to feel better. And that's the way I sort of see it.
Yeah, and I guess I wish maybe the conversation could sort of try to respect two separate domains, where the domain of personal morality, where we, you know, are hopefully struggling to decrease our own carbon footprint on the one hand, and then the domain of the political changes that we should all be agitating for. And so like when you see someone, and there's many examples, this is, you know, he's a famous example, but this line of reasoning, this line of rhetoric comes up all the time in the discourse. And I think it's a huge distraction, where you have someone whose life is dedicated to actively and successfully affecting American policy for the good. You know, moral failings, or you might call them, or weaknesses of indulgences that he might have in his private life are sort of immaterial to the broader political struggle which is going on. Is that reasonable?
Totally. Yeah, I totally. And when you sort of think about the things that we can do as individuals, and the things that, you know, we can feel strongly about, I often think about things in terms of internal actions and external actions. You know, your external actions are, you know, talking to people about the things that you're concerned about. It's talking about the sort of the difficulties that you face in taking the actions that you want. You know, say you want to stop flying. I mean, that's just really difficult if you rely on that to see family across the world or something. You know, I mean, these are really difficult choices. But talking about them to other people, externalizing those discussions, can help you sort of negotiate them and figure them out. You know, other external things that, you know, activism and those things that you can do in order to further a cause, to make your voice heard. And then on the internal side is what we just already been talking about, this sort of like this emotional negotiation of what you can do. I mean, from a morality perspective, there are ways in which you could see how it's justifiable to actually emit more in the short term in certain situations than in the long term. For example, if you have heat waves coming through, and Europe now is going to get a whole bunch of air conditioners because we're getting hotter and hotter over here. Does that mean then that you shouldn't be turning on those air conditioners because the grid is still partially driven by fossil fuels? Well, actually, there's a moral choice there. There's a moral trade-off in what you do. So yeah, I think these are hugely difficult questions, and I think you can alienate people very, very quickly from being engaged by focusing too much on what other people are doing. These charges of hypocrisy and these sorts of things. I think you're quite right.
Yeah, and then another thing which your book sort of, I think, deals with a little bit is, again, as someone who's affluent and feels guilt for a certain lifestyle, choices or moral failings, you might say, I want to be able to just donate money to sort of assuage my guilt. And I, to some extent, I do donate money to various causes, causes that like buy up land or plant trees. Is that a fool's errand? Is that a waste of time? Is that possible to donate money to sort of?
It's such a great question. So you have to be very, very careful. A lot of these schemes are not what they seem. And when you donate a plant, for example, we don't know what kinds of extremes they may see in the future. So, already a lot of the sort of carbon credits that people have bought in California, for example, have gone up in smoke during fires. So you have to be incredibly careful about and look into what it is that you're actually signing up to. And I know that's not a great message, and that might be a demotivating message, actually. What I would say is, if you are going to donate to things, donate to things locally, things that you can see. So there's so much good work being done in so many different areas. I mean, even here in The Hague, in the Netherlands, for example, we have a charity that brings in food from the community gardens around The Hague, and then distributes that around The Hague. So these sorts of things. There's natural climate solutions, sort of ecological solutions which need money. Look closely nearby you what's happening and what you can donate with would be my suggestion. And if you really want to look at getting rid of your whole guilt, right? So say, just hypothetically, you could just get rid of your entire carbon footprint. How much would that cost? Well, you can do direct air capture, and direct air capture would cost you around $10,000 a year for European emissions, and about $15,000 to $20,000 a year for US emissions. Now that price is going to come down over time, but that's kind of the amount that you're talking about. So then maybe just have a think, would you rather pay that money or make some change?
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah.
And the other thing that you want to think about is, if you are going to sort of do sort of direct air capture of things, there are huge issues with that in terms of the materials used, the other environmental issues. So maybe it's worthwhile, reducing what you can before you take the sort of final step of oh, okay, I'm just going to pay for, sequestering this carbon away.
And there's a big market around that, right? There's a big market of massaging people like me, massaging their guilt, and companies also, they claim net zero emissions by, planting trees and things like that. And I think what your book talks about is a lot of it is a distraction, and a lot of it is a way of sort of trying to PR, public relations, trying to put a face on something that you can't really ignore.
There's a lot of greenwashing, and if you there's on these flight websites, they'll say, oh, you can offset for $1,
Right.
I mean, if you believe that, I mean, do you really think you can believe $1, to offset a flight? So just be a bit wary about it, I think. And as I say, local solutions are going to have to, be everywhere. So, look locally and look what you can be involved with it also as a community.
Yeah. Okay. That's great. We're basically, we got to wrap up. This has been going on for an hour. I guess the last thing I just want to sort of ask you about is sort of how it's affected your life and from a psychological perspective. You talk in the book how this is actually a quote I have open: the sheer expanse of the issue explains why people struggle to talk about it. How can you bring up such a problem in polite conversation? It's like dropping news of terminal cancer in an office canteen. How do you how has this work affected you? And I guess sort of what are your closing thoughts for us as we sign off here?
Well, I mean, I think with that quote, I think I'm just trying to reflect what a lot of people feel about it. One of the ways it's affected me is that I don't actually think that anymore. I'll just drop that. I'll drop this information into any work meeting that I have.
Yeah.
Even if this is an administrative meeting about something totally different, and you might be thinking, well, it must be great fun in meetings, but I just think it puts things in perspective a little bit about what we should be, focusing on as institutions. Things like the university. How's it affected me? It was very, we often talk about, we often write in scientific papers in a very sort of non-emotional way. And so when I write papers, although it can be very sort of, it can be quite depressing to read a lot of the research that's coming out. There's a lot of the climate research and the risky research. It is somehow sanitized by the language. And I think that's also maybe a disservice that scientists do to one another. I mean, we have to have that desanitized language in the scientific literature, but perhaps when we're talking to one another, we can be a little bit more, engaged in the sort of emotions of how this makes us feel. Because once you start to write it, and in the book, I try to engage with these emotions. When you read that quote earlier, that was a real struggle to write, clearly. I mean, I think for me, it's made me much less quiet about the issues, about speaking up in meetings and things like this. And I hope it's the same for other people as well, when they read the book, that they feel like they are well armed, that they have the information to hand. They know, they have a sense of how fast things have to move and what the priorities really need to be in order to secure a livable future. And that's what I hope people get from the book as well.
Yeah. Dr. Paul Behrens, it was an incredibly insightful read and a really informative, eye-opening read in a lot of ways. It was a great read in addition to being informative. And this conversation has also been really insightful and informative. And I thank you so much for your.
Thanks, Anakai. It's great to talk with you.
Yeah. Have a great day.